Yeah.
The university.
Well, this is Good evening. My name is Mark Smith. I'm the director of the University of Stellenbosch Business School. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, both in person and online, to the inaugural lecture of Professor Brian Ganson. I have a few specific people I'd like to welcome. Firstly, the Vice Rector of Personnel and Transformation, Professor Nico Kopman. Vice Deans in Faculty, Profs Borshoff, Pillay, and Dupria, online. Brian's mother, Evelyn Ganson in Massachusetts. Brian's brother, Paul Ganson, also in Massachusetts. Brian's brother, Tom Ganson, in Hawaii. Brian's niece, Laura, in North Carolina. And members of the Business School's Advisory Board, members of the faculty, colleagues, family and friends. An inaugural lecture is a very distinctive moment in a professor's life, an academic's career. It's an opportunity for a professor to share their experiences, share their specific, sometimes quite esoteric subjects that they've been researching and studying over time. Because this is not just a moment to present to academic peers, but a moment to present to family, friends, and the wider public. This is a moment for sharing the impact and the consequences of one's work. And at a time when research and expertise becomes rather focused, it's an opportunity to spread that knowledge to a wider group of people. In this context, we see the challenge of professing both as an expert, but also to the wider public and society at large. It's a great honour for me to welcome you here for this inaugural for Professor Ganson. Before he shares his knowledge, I'd like to introduce him more personally. So Brian got his Juris Doctor with honours from Harvard Law School. He has a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He has a Bachelor of Arts with high distinction from the University of Michigan. His long and varied career includes commencing first as a family mediator at the tender age of just 20, where he promoted human rights as an advocate in Texas, helped to expand access to quality education for underserved populations. He later served as a former mediation practitioner, trainer, clinical supervisor with the Harvard Mediation Program. He's worked with companies, communities, governments, development actors to implement systems in relation to conflict prevention and resolution at local, national and international levels. He specializes in negotiation and mediation in the context of social and political strife. Prof. Ganson has taught negotiation, mediation, conflict risk mitigation for more than 30 years. This includes institutions including Harvard University, Stellenbosch University, the Fletcher School at Tufts, and the University of Cape Town. He's also served previously as a senior researcher at the Fletcher School for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution, as Director for Conflict Management Group, a non-profit consulting firm founded to apply innovative approaches to Harvard Negotiation Project. He's a co-founder of the organizational practices at the Mitchell-Madison Group, where he consulted Fortune 100 companies. Earlier, he served as Chief of Staff, Assistant Secretary of Civil Rights at the US Department of Education. Prof. Ganson's work has been characterized as finding himself and working in particularly challenging environments. Examples of this include his advisory work in conflict risk assessment, mitigation planning with mining companies in Africa and Latin America, collaboration with NGOs and engagement strategies in mining-affected communities in the DRC, peace-positive development in Kosovo, conflict mapping in relation to extractive industries in Latin America. He's counseled United Nations agencies, He's worked with the IFC on operations in violent socio-political conflicts, worked with the UNDP in Africa, chair of the expert panel on food and agriculture for the Organization for United Nations. He's helped work in multinational corporations, development agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and a full range of emerging economies and post-conflict environments. For us, at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, he leads the Africa Centre for Dispute Settlement. It's a platform for research and dialogue at the nexus of business, conflict, and development. This work brings together business, government, labour, and communities to reduce the costs of conflict and increase collaborative opportunities. He's also published in some of the leading management journals in the world, including the first of our academics in the business school to publish in the Academy of Management Review, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Brian Ganson.
All right, and Mark, thank you for the warm introduction. It is an honor to stand here as a professor within such a vibrant, diverse, and committed university community. My address is about business actors, social conflict, and cohesion. First, our apparent inability to build coalitions for positive change across the many divisions in our society. Second, how many business actors knowingly or indifferently feed that crisis of incohesion. Third, challenges for a private sector that contributes to cohesion across social groups. And fourth, implications for us as business educators and researchers. You'll hear me talk about our work. By this, I refer to a variety of collaborations with amazing and insightful colleagues here and around the globe. I am privileged to work with and learn from each of them, many of whom will be referenced in this address. But first, let me introduce you to my mother, Evelyn Ganson. She was an early pioneer in information technology. She overcame significant blatant discrimination to build a company that she ran with integrity towards her employees and her clients. She is a scientist at heart. She has been nationally recognized in the United States for her contributions to marine mammal conservation. And in her 70s, she learned to pilot a submarine side-scan radar towfish to search for shipwrecks, which is just plain cool. I will come back to her and other mothers later, but for now, let me just say, hi, Mom, thank you for being an inspiration. Around the world, political violence, from violent protests to outright war, is at a 30-year high. Here in Africa, more than 1 in 4 members of the African Union, that's 15 countries, are at war today. Closer to home, we recently undertook work in Langa, the first township to which Cape Town's black residents were removed, and a site of the apartheid government's murderous response to pass law protests in 1960. Our work there documents how legacies of this structural violence are fed by current government and private sector practices, such as privileging of large enterprises over the small businesses that are integral parts of systems of community resilience. This structural violence combines with interpersonal violence and criminal violence to create one of the highest violent death rates in the world, at the same time undermining community efforts at cultural, political, and economic cohesion. Study after study show that at the heart of this global pandemic of political turmoil and violence are marginalization, exclusion, and inequality between black and white, haves and have-nots, rural and urban, the informal and formal economies, the beneficiaries of globalization, and its victims. The list goes on. Tensions between identity groups make it harder and harder for people of goodwill in all groups to come together across group boundaries. Under stress, each group, whether defined by culture, politics, history, or otherwise, retreats into its own corner. And to paraphrase Chinua Achebe, we fall apart, and the center cannot hold. Our new work, published in the Academy of Management Review, pulls together these strands of research, underlining how conflicts between social groups and the conflicts they engender reinforce cycles of violence, retard economic progress, undermine democracy and good governance, and negatively impact public goods. Because we are prone in situations of conflict to withdraw into our own identity groups, we cannot make good progress on issues that require cooperation across groups. This is true even on issues, for example, that all children should be safe, that they should have enough food to eat, that they should have a quality education, on which effectively all of us agree. We are stuck in a downward cycle. New work to be published in the Harvard Business Review later this year draws from our survey of some 17,000 people in 7 global cities in crisis, including Cape Town. It shows that for young adults in Cape Town, more than 50% have personally experienced violence in the last 4 years. They are also the age group most likely to experience government actors as the primary instigators of violence and extortion. Unsurprisingly, they are therefore the age group most likely to build relationships with violent actors to cope with social crisis. They are the most likely to see criminal gangs as positive forces in their communities. They are twice as likely as their elders to see violence as justified. None of us in any social group want these outcomes for the next generation. And yet we seem unable to work together to reverse these trends. So let me come back to my mother, and in fact to all of our USB mothers, a number of whom are no longer with us and some of whom passed only this past year. I want to thank my USB colleagues for allowing me to gather our mothers and their wisdom here, because they did not teach us the lessons of division. They rather channeled the wisdom of the ages, that to survive and thrive as families and communities and societies, we have to come together despite our differences. So if cohesion is the lesson of our mothers, what is driving us apart? Because we're here at the business school, I will focus on the role of business actors in social conflict and in cohesion. We who work with the private sector have long had an exuberantly optimistic view of the role of business in society, even declaring ourselves an unmatched force for peace. This is counterfactual. The evidence is stark. In divided societies such as our own, business is far more likely to entrench winning and losing groups, and thus to increase intergroup friction, tensions, and conflict. There are a variety of mechanisms of action by which this occurs. The simplest to understand is when business literally destroys community and drives people apart. These quotes you see are from student fieldwork supervised by the Africa Center for Dispute Settlement. The government of Uganda wanted to allocate land to a foreign company for forestry development, but there were people living on it. So the army went in with guns and flamethrowers, chasing them out. And yet, the company had no qualms taking possession of the land. The International Finance Corporation had no qualms financing its operations. And the company's international commercial customers have no qualms buying its lumber even today. This example is not an outlier. Our work shows similar examples in every fragile and conflict-affected state in the world. Yet, the mechanisms by which business actors increase social divisions need not be so stark. They are often tied to pathways of private sector development that privilege the few while excluding the many. Our work documents how in Sierra Leone, the policies of the World Bank, development finance institutions, bilateral donors, and the national government focused on, as they said, rebuilding the post-war economy. The problem is they rebuilt the very same dynamics of grievance and exclusion that were root causes of the country's endemic instability and then civil war. These include inattentiveness to the informal sector, intergroup inequality and ethnic exclusion, elite enrichment, and the abuse of the state security apparatus for economic gain. Companies still had impunity for their negative social and environmental impacts. That's what we rebuilt. Our broader study of business environment reforms in Africa shows much the same. Private sector development, which does not explicitly engage and address intergroup inequalities and power contestation, drives social division and undermines human development. In divided societies, a confluence of dynamics make it hard for groups to come together. This rather complicated causal loop diagram comes from Barcarena, an industrial port city in Brazil. Like Langa, it is one of the most violent places in the world. And it is racked by similar social crises: unresolved indigenous land claims, pollution, underemployment, and dysfunctional public services. Citizens, human rights advocates, and NGOs from different parts of the community pose the question: why is it so hard for us to build coalitions strong enough to bring about positive change? We helped to facilitate the analysis that identified the key dynamics of incohesion there. These included economic injustice, structural exclusion, physical insecurity, and inter- and intra-group conflict. Their causes, consequences, and interrelationships are laid out in the summary analysis you see here. And what we found is that many individual business strategies, leader behaviors, and operational decisions, often seemingly small or innocuous, create tensions that exacerbate social divisions and thus undermine citizen efforts to come together. It happens when a company takes advantage of bad or distant relationships between different groups in society, what network analysis calls a structural hole. By hoarding information and dealing separately with different parties, a company can often negotiate better terms for itself. In Barcarena, we saw this when Norsk Hydro, the largest company in the region, withheld environmental data from community advocates worried about the health effects of pollution. They dealt rather only with the sympathetic government officials. Here in South Africa, we see mining companies dealing separately with national, provincial, local, and traditional authorities. These strategies increase conflict between citizens and their government and between different groups in society. It would be far better for the rest of us if companies brought all the parties to the table to analyze the situation together and to find common ground on a pathway forward. But companies can rather exploit structural holes to their own advantage. Another dynamic of incohesion presents when companies align themselves with the already powerful, ignoring the poor and disenfranchised. In Barcarena, this occurred when Norsk Hydro signed on as a partner to a government plan to build a rail line through indigenous lands. This aligned the company with the government against indigenous peoples, further suppressing the rights of the already marginalized. Here in South Africa, companies are roundly condemned by the South African Human Rights Commission and our Constitutional Court for failing to give adequate voice to communities and their decision-making rights. Acting in these ways, companies often get what they want, but they further divide society in ways that escalate conflict and make social problems even harder to solve. What our work in Barcarena and Langa and elsewhere shows is that decisions of companies, small and large, negatively impact social cohesion. Buying uniforms slightly more cheaply abroad saves money for the company, but increases local economic insecurity in ways that increase competition and thus tensions between struggling groups. We see that in the xenophobic violence here in South African townships as well. Dragging out the resolution of long-standing land claims leaves people who lived from that land without a reliable source of food, increasing reliance on the criminal economy. Giving contracts and benefits to sympathetic local leaders over those more critical of the company and its role increases tensions within communities and reduces leader accountability. Cynically taking advantage of lower environmental standards by saying, hey, we're following the law, leaves people already without access to health care, even sicker, even weaker, and even less able to organize to assert their rights. Cumulatively, as illustrated here, the effects are profound. This illustrates how the sum of business strategies and actions, at least in conflict-affected contexts such as our own, may work well for the companies involved, but deliver sorely suboptimal outcomes from the perspective of social cohesion and the ability of people to solve problems across identity group boundaries. So far, I've talked about the negative effects of business actors on social cohesion. Is positive impact as simple as turning these divisive strategies on their head? To some extent, yes. If you want better relationships with your neighbor, a good place to start is to stop punching her in the nose. And in fact, companies that apply frameworks of do no harm, conflict-sensitive business practice, and human rights due diligence are far less likely to have negative effects, and we have also documented some positive effects on social cohesion, particularly at the local level. But there are still dilemmas to address when considering a private sector that enhances social cohesion. The first is that companies are rarely willing to invest in the skills and capabilities they need to understand and address incohesion. This is often because they don't have to. They have less difficult and less expensive ways to protect their own interests. These include subsidies and protections they negotiate with development finance institutions, various forms of insurance, and the ability to spread risk across an international portfolio. The second is that change requires non-market as well as market strategies. Companies take potentially unprofitable political risks when they stand up for social solidarity and justice. This is one reason why, as late as 1989, the consultative business movement in South Africa could count only 40 business members who declared themselves in favor of a democratic transition. 40 businesses, all of South Africa, 1989. Third, changes in conflict systems require more than doing some good. They require profound shifts in power relations and institutional arrangements. Drops in the bucket are not enough. Coordinated and coherent action across groups and societies is required to change conflict systems. Yet, companies are often loath to allow others to influence their strategies and operational decisions. Fourth, it takes a long time to build working trust and strong coalitions. Move fast and break things is not a strategy for social cohesion and peaceful change. Fifth, and most profoundly, many business incumbents simply do not benefit from social cohesion. Here, I'll tell a story of a process facilitated by the Africa Centre for Dispute Settlement. Tesco, the UK retailer, wanted to show that it was supporting resolution of wage complaints between farm workers and farmers in its supply chain here in the Western Cape. This was part of an international human rights campaign. Farmers and farm worker advocates, in fact, overcame significant mistrust to examine the issues together. And what they together determined was that a party was missing from the table. They asked Tesco to join discussions of how exceedingly low prices paid for fruit made paying just wages nearly impossible. Tesco declined. They said, this process wasn't meant to be about us. And the process fell apart. Too many incumbent major business actors simply do not want, and with their current business models could not survive in a world in which the rest of us came together to demand just and peaceful development for all. Here in South Africa, our history of corporatized slavery through the Dutch East India Company, corporatized imperialism through the British South Africa Company, and the symbiotic relationship of businesses small and large with the apartheid state make us profoundly aware of the key thesis of this address. The day-to-day strategic and operational decisions of business actors have a profound and far too often negative effect on social cohesion. So, what is our role as a business school in eliminating ways of doing business that are rooted in a divisive past? How do we become catalysts of social cohesion that move society from us and them to all of us. Don't we like that better? Isn't it nice to retire the divisive symbols of the past and bring forward a hopeful symbol of moving forward together? One obvious implication is in business education. We need to get honest with ourselves and with our students. In divided societies such as our own, there are in fact substantial tensions between profits and people on the planet. Furthermore, many will oppose changes in a system from which they benefit. There is no easy path forward. Our students should be equipped with the tools they need to be citizen activists and courageous change leaders, even in the face of internal and external institutional opposition. Second, we can direct our research toward social cohesion. We have known for a very, very long time that business is far too often a driver of incohesion. Already in the 1600s, the Dutch East India Company was called criminal and murderous by its own employees. Already in the 1800s, Rhodes' crimes against humanity were called out in the British press. And yet, we see the persistence of these same business patterns today, as illustrated here by findings of the South African Human Rights Commission in 2018. We, as business school researchers, need to study the factors, ideological and legal, economic and political, social and psychological, that enable the persistence of destructive business enterprises so that we can weed them out. We should not allow businesses that exploit or ignore incohesion to undermine those that work in the interests of social cohesion and inclusive development. This points towards a related research agenda. We can posit from our experience that the fit-for-purpose African enterprise, one that meets the needs of the poor first, that serves as a platform for constructive stakeholder engagement, that acts in the public trust, and that maximizes social cohesion, has not yet been invented. This requires a different take on entrepreneurship, not one focused on succeeding within a broken system, but rather one dedicated to transforming that system in the interest of social cohesion and inclusive development. These ideas may help to break the cycle of incohesion. But history shows that we in business are slow to learn. The first meeting of apartheid-era white business leaders with mass movement leaders here in Cape Town came so late that it was interrupted by Nelson Mandela's release from prison, 30 years after the political massacre in Langa. We're a little slow on the uptake. We are also quick to forget. Once the risk of revolution passed and property rights were protected with the new Constitution of 1996, the private sector quickly abandoned the structures and principles of the consultative business movement that had in fact been a major factor in bringing peace, and went back to business as usual. So, what will make us quicker to learn, slower to forget, and more reliably focused as a business community on social cohesion? Concurrently with my primary appointment here at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, I am a professor at our new school for data science and computational thinking. Wearing that hat, we are applying the tools of data science to better understand the interrelationships of the private sector, conflict, and peaceful development. Combining geospatial data structuring with network analysis and natural language processing, we will soon be able to reliably determine what we might call an Ubuntu Index, the degree of conflict or social cohesion reported at any geographic scale, from the continent as a whole to a 50 by 50 kilometer grid cell. Furthermore, we will be able to associate movement in this Ubuntu Index with actors such as a particular company, issues such as wages or pollution, and events such as the expansion or closing of business operations. So let me immodestly suggest that we use our Stellenbosch Ubuntu Index, even if for now in its conceptual form, to discipline our thinking and action, keeping us attentive to the values of social cohesion and human dignity as set out in the South African Constitution. We can posit as a universal leadership goal improvement in the Ubuntu Index. We can incorporate the measure of Ubuntu into every classroom and decision-making framework, asking whether our market and non-market strategies, our stakeholder relationships and corporate governance, and our plans and operations will cause the index to rise or fall. We can research business dynamics that undermine improvements in Ubuntu Index scores, as well as the business forms and business strategies most likely to sustain and accelerate their rise. The Ubuntu Index won't fix our societal problems on its own, but it will remind us that because of our history, we need to set a higher standard for business and social cohesion. It will help more people to leverage the potential of the private sector to build social cohesion despite our endemic intergroup conflicts. And it will help the overwhelming majority, those who wake up every day hoping for, believing in, and willing to work for a better South Africa, to find that they indeed have the means to move from incohesion and collective inaction towards social cohesion and the achievement of peaceful development for all. Nkosi, dankie, thank you very much.
Dear Director, mother, brothers and family of Prof. Ganson, guests online, colleagues, students. Prof. Ganson, what a joy to share in this important event and to hear what you, as a full professor at our institution, will keep on professing. Prof. Ganson is a professor in the Business School of Stellenbosch University. Business School is based in the Faculty of Economics and Management Sciences. In economics, we seek to put it literally in the original Greek, the nomos for the oikos, the law for the household, the policies, the plans, the models, the practices for the household that we jointly inhabit as humans and nature. As a person also trained in law, Prof, you refer to the South African Constitution of 1996. That Constitution indicates what the features are of life in this household, this oikos. These features are echoed in the transformation plan of Stellenbosch University, and they are dignity for all, healing of all wounds for all, justice for all, freedom for all, and equality for all. Economics, the business, sciences, develop guidelines and models and proposals to enhance these features in the household. The management sciences at our institution reflect on this mandate. Prof. Ganson, you in a very interesting, exciting, and I must say so, late afternoon, energizing way, blur the lines between public and private. You convincingly show how the so-called private sector is very public. You prompt us to see how the private sector is public and how it does already impact on all publics of life, from the most intimate public to the most visible, even the most cosmic public. You help us to see how the so-called private sector can form relationships and partnerships with various publics, namely the publics of the academy, the public of the political sector, of civil society, and of the spheres of public discourse, public opinion formation, and public policy making. In partnership, I infer from what you say, we can overcome in cohesion and inaction. And in partnership, we can build social cohesion and social action. And it is social cohesion in search of peace. And the peace that I hear about tonight is peace that is only real and only lasting when it rests in dignity for all, healing for all, justice for all, freedom and equality for all. Your plea, Prof, for social cohesion in search of peace and justice really strikes a chord with me. And will you allow me to quote quite extensively from your written text? Because I want us to, in future, unpick what you say here. And I quote you, and with this I conclude. At the heart of our collective unwillingness or inability to interrupt and reverse this downward cycle of social crisis and violence is our lack of social cohesion. Divisions in society between black and white, urban and rural, labor and management, haves and have-nots, beneficiaries and victims of globalization, the list goes on, allow us to compartmentalize and discount inequalities that we do not perceive as central to us, and thus rather leave to some amorphous them to resolve. For example, among all racial and ethnic groups in our country, white South Africans are least likely by far to experience poverty. They are perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, the least likely group to perceive any enduring legacies from apartheid, and the least likely to believe that land reform is important to addressing inequality. Lingering injustice and the sense that the rich and powerful are fundamentally indifferent to it empowers ethno-populist political entrepreneurship, as well as the increase in party politics influenced by racial division. These intentionally divisive tactics make dealing even with issues of broad concern such as public and private corruption that undermines service delivery nearly impossible across identity groups. Thus, we see how distinguishing them from us inhibits effective collective action and explains outcomes such as state capture, which in turn make a host of pressing issues harder to address. I look forward to unpack with you and in communion with our academic colleagues and all colleagues at the institution these rich thoughts that you share. Congratulations, Prof. Brian. We look forward to journeying with you as Stellenbosch University attempts to be a university that makes a reciprocal, transformative impact internal to the university and externally in local, continental, and global contexts. Your work as a professor helps us with this mandate. Until now, through your academic labor, you made great contributions. And may I also say, in your more non-formal interaction, even with management of the institution, on various burning issues, you are already helping us greatly, and we look forward to journeying with you in that sense as well. I have great pleasure in handing you this certificate on behalf of our rector.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Falls upon me to thank Prof. Brian Ganson, the audience here tonight, the audience online, Prof. Koopman, everybody for participating this evening. I think we should thank Brian's mum as well. Brian's mum clearly is somebody who challenges stereotypes, and Brian's done that as himself this evening. You see how sometimes business schools are seen as we're under a certain stereotype of promoting a certain type of activity, promoting certain types of research, often criticized for some of the ills and the extremes of business behavior. Brian's demonstration tonight of his research demonstrates how business schools can actually be an actor for better understanding of the complex ways that business and society and the economy works, to shine a light on that. Shine a light to help students, the wider public, other researchers to understand the interaction between these different actors, and perhaps create more responsible leaders among the people who leave University of Stellenbosch Business School and the people who read Brian's work. Brian himself perhaps challenges stereotypes of a traditional professor, somebody who has taken a varied career path to get to this point through not-for-profits, through advising business, through working with international organizations, through working with government organizations. A career that's taken on courageous topics, courageous research themes. A career that's also collaborative with other partners inside the university, with different types of actors in the public, private, not-for-profit sector. But also one that's impactful upon state, upon different acts in society, impactful through the excellence of his research, publishing leading journals, impactful through his teaching in this institution and other areas, but impactful also through his engagement with wider media. I think we've learned tonight how an understanding of the way actors behave in the economy, businesses that might portray themselves as doing good may have negative consequences. Sometimes we see in Brian's paper unintended consequences that are not necessarily good for themselves even. But also the dynamics of inequalities and incohesion and how that can impact upon the organizations themselves, upon us as members of society, and upon the wider interactions that we experience. Perhaps also a little sign of hope. Maybe that hope comes from the Stellenbosch Ubuntu Index that Brian's working on. Perhaps the hope comes from just remembering that we're slow to learn and we're quick to forget. Thank you once again, Brian, for a really inspirational talk. Thank you everybody for participating. Thanks, Brian's mum, for inspiring Brian and all of us. Have a good evening.